Hello and welcome to Ikike Digest, your learning space on Home TV. I am Kome Odomo. On Ikike Digest, we aim to continuously bring to light environmental issues as it affects community and our food system, provide our listeners with adequate information as regards the environment. In today's edition, we will be looking at climate change and insecurity, focusing on Nigeria. You'd agree with me that climate change and insecurity are interestingly connected. Issues of climate change, especially in Nigeria, where environmental degradation and socio-economic challenges are significant. Climate change has intensified security risk by disrupting livelihoods and fueling resource scarcity, while contributing to conflicts over diminishing resource. It is pertinent to say that climate change is a multiplier of insecurity in Nigeria, exacerbating resource-based conflicts, increasing poverty, and pushing marginalized community towards involving in violence and illegal activities. In addressing these challenges, it requires a coordinated effort to tackle environmental degradation and the socio-economic factors that drives conflicts. To discuss this issue with me today is Salaudeen Hashim, who will critically examine climate change and insecurity. Salaudeen Hashim is a program director with Clean Foundation and an expert on defense, security, and counter-terrorism practitioner. He has over a decade of experience in various defense and contemporary security issues and is a convener of the National Peace and Security Forum. Welcome, Salaud.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we know that you've been consciously pushing these things around climate change. Can you describe how climate change has impacted regions, and in what ways have you seen these environmental changes?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Climate change actually has a multidimensional effect on communities and the people alike. And then, of course, it has consistently, adversely backtrack the kind of progression that we want to see, particularly in communities as it affects stakeholders. I tell you, if you go to various regions across the country, from the northeast, when you have the heavy encroachment of the Sahel, and then, of course, you see that this has actually fueled the level of migration of people, and of course, the river basin itself, the Lake Chad, is also drying up, and this in itself is as a result of global warming, and some of the activities going on in that region in itself is adversely affecting people's lives. If you come to the northwest and the north central, you realize that there are also similar interventions and situations playing out. And when you come to the south, you realize that the issue of sea level rising, and then of course the temperature that is also adversely affecting. And you will also find out that in all of these things, livelihood are constantly being lost. And one of the basic things that you realize is if you take a man out of his natural habitat, there are quite a number of consequences. And the first consequence is the fact that the man actually loses his livelihood. And that in itself has a way of challenging the kinds of alternatives and the alternative pathway that such individual might also want to adopt. So by and large, we have seen the fact that the pattern changes both in the rising sea level, in the rainfall, and of course for us in the Niger Delta is the fact that the mangroves and the entire tropics is also adversely being challenged as a result of climate change. And we have realized how this is particularly challenging the existing template of existence within that particular region. And two examples very quickly is the fact that this has actually reduced life expectancy, particularly in the Niger Delta, 11 years below national average. And that in itself is a major worry in various communities. Two is the fact that we now have a number of gender dimensions that has adversely been affected as a result of this. Yeah. Because again, the men would either quickly lose their life as a result of the inability to cope with the changes, and women become the breadwinners, or that they go in search of new livelihood elsewhere, and then of course it still allowed women to become the breadwinner. So either way, the pattern of existence and lifestyle has actually shifted. And this in itself is affecting the social, economic, political, and cultural existence of the country. Unfortunately, there are no immediate responses coming from the side of the government.
Okay, so let me take it from this angle now. You talked about these challenges that are being caused. Now let's look at conflicts and illegal activities. To use the word illegal, what's the connection? What's the nexus between the rise of insecurity and climate change?
Oh yeah, I mean there is an intersection between climate change and insecurity. I'll give you an example. Once the Sahel becomes a little bit fast encroaching in the northeast, and you cannot recharge Lake Chad because of the inability of the countries within the river basin to do that, you will see heavy migration of nomads into the tropics, and particularly because they believe that coming downward into the south will allow them to be able to also feed their livestock.
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, you will realize that they have to go through certain chain of movement. In the past, there used to be some level of channel within which these movements are regulated, and thereby not allowing for some kind of encroachment into people's farms. So the farmer-herder conflict that you see today, or that you have heard about, that has taken so many lives, is actually directly connected to the issue that borders around climate change. So in the process of movement, obviously they will trample on people's farms, and that in itself is somebody else's livelihood. Yes, livestock and actually tending those livestock is the way of life for the person who is doing the nomad. And you know, once resource is actually involved in a particular conversation, that competition for either keeping away or wanting to stay on brings the kind of conflict that we see. So therefore, that movement actually encourages the invasion of farms, and that is actually the source of the conflict that we see. Two is the fact that there is a popular belief that when nomads come very close to the Benue Valley and somewhere around the north central region, that there is the myth that is being believed that livestock and the lush there are actually blessed to the extent that their livestock can give birth twice in a year.
So it's safe to say that it's our resources that produce these conflicts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It is actually either the absence of those resources that in a particular region, forcing people out of their habitat, moving into a new location. That in itself is where the conflict actually emanates from. Because in the process of forcing you out, obviously you must find alternative. Those alternatives are also somebody else's primary sources of livelihood. Therefore, there will be some level of competition. It is that competition that actually brings the conflict that we talk about. And that in itself has actually claimed so many lives in the process of trying to get those things settled.
So as a gender specialist in dealing with the women and the men, what are the specific challenges that are peculiar to women and those that are peculiar to men? I know you've talked about women trying to be in charge of the home by being the breadwinners, but are there any other challenges that you think climate change issues have raised over time?
Yeah, absolutely. For men is the fact that it has a lot of social impact. One is that they are unable to, a man's biggest capability is actually his economy. And once it affects, anything that affects his economy perhaps has affected his existence. So once a man loses his livelihood, you have indirectly taken away one very big dignity component out of him. So that in itself is an established fact. Two is the fact that because of the activities of private sector or most of the IOCs, it has actually forced some level of unnatural pattern changes in the environment and in the atmosphere. And that in itself has created a new normal for some people. And I'll give you an example. In Kaduna, there is a refinery, and the entire community that borders that particular refinery, the women came out in large numbers to protest recently. And the protest was simply put that their men can no longer function as husbands at home anymore, because the entire atmosphere and the gaseous releases in those kind of has actually affected their reproductive system. And it is also the same for women. If you go into the hinterlands in the Niger Delta, you will realize that a number of women also have issues that borders around changes in their hormones. And this is actually as a result of changes in the entire pattern. Although sometimes it is actually as a result of the activities of production or extraction that has actually forced those changes. Cancer villages are building up in the Niger Delta. True. That is actually a situation. Reproductive health of women are naturally being affected.
And even the life expectancy.
Absolutely, which is above the WHO standard. And the consequence is that in the nearest future, we might be seeing some level of children who will be given birth to that are going to be deformed as a result of these constant changes in pattern. If you go to Zamfara, there is a particular community where extraction is massive. And the poison that is being released as a result of extraction has actually killed over 5,000 in that particular location, both women, children.
Where?
In Zamfara State. And it has actually affected the level at which these women also function. So you realize that it is actually a national emergency. Unfortunately, we don't have a very clear-cut response plan to be able to manage the consequences that are coming as a result of this. And of course, because it is not justiciable, it is difficult to be able to challenge the state in any constitutional court to say, look, it is as a result of the inability of the state to do this that has created this. And maybe finally again, is the fact that the regulators who ought to therefore hold the operators to account are also not doing the same. If you go to the north central part where some private organizations are actually working, perhaps not to mention the name on camera, but there's a very large cement factory that is also happening in the north central, particularly in Kogi axis. And you'll see a number of activities going on there is actually therefore affecting the lives of the community. So what is the environmental factor? What is the social factor? What is the health factor? What is the environmental, social, health, and of course, even the entire economy of that part? It changes almost immediately because of the absence of adequate framework that is safeguarding those people who are actually being affected. And how do we deal with this? I think there must be the whole of society approach in trying to manage the consequences of what we see currently happening in these regions.
Thank you for that in-depth knowledge of how communities are battling with insecurity as a result of climate change. It's really heartbreaking to see that women are now being handed the responsibility of being in charge of homes, and the men are facing issues with fertility, so to speak. But we'll go on a short break, and when we'll return, we would learn more of how communities are battling with insecurity and how they tend to solve these problems without government assistance.
Are you looking for a conducive and serene environment to carry out your research works and need the right content to be at your best? Are you a lover of academics and intellectual books? Do you seek proper works of research for knowledge enhancement? Or you want a place to read at your leisure? The HomeF Library and Resource Center is the right place to be. With our well-arranged and fully stocked bookshelves, searching for your preferred genres and authors is made much easier than you could ever imagine. With our well-experienced librarians and guides, you've got a reading and research pleasure to catch up with. At HomeF Library and Resource Center, Benin City, Nigeria, it is simply an unforgettable experience.
Welcome back. You've been listening to Salaudeen Hashim, who is a programs director at Clean Foundation and a security expert and defense expert also. Salaudeen, before we went on the break, was telling us how women have been coping with climate change, and particular about women, because of recent, it feels like the women are at the forefront of everything, trying to make sure all of these happen. But can you throw more light on how this has affected the home fronts? Because we know from the everyday situation that our men want to be in charge. But with the issue of climate change and these insecurity issues, we know that this can also be a tend to raise community violence, so to say. Because in a recent research that was conducted, where women felt that they need electricity to be able to use the latrines, use their toilets, which are outside their homes. And a group of people provided these lanterns for them in their community. But it was now an avenue for the men to use that lamp as their play, to provide lights for them when they sit out in the night to play. Now it didn't solve the issue why it was provided, because the women needed these lights to use the toilets at night. But then the men converted it to provide lighting when they sit out with their peers. And then it didn't solve that issue. Now women are taking the center stage. Is it solving the issue on the home front?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, look, once you take away the economy of a family and anything that affects or threatens the economy of a home front, of any home front, opportunities are there that it will actually change the pattern of relationship in the home. The best investment on earth is the earth itself. And once you take away that earth and anything affects it, obviously it affects the entire livelihood or well-being around it. And one of the very quick things that you can point at once this happens is the fact that there will be some level of tension in the home front. And this has actually been affecting the kind of rise in gender-based violence that we have actually noticed. And again, because this is also some kind of pressure on the economy, we have also seen children who have also chosen a different pathway, particularly because, again, children are no longer children. They need to become breadwinners in the home. And this also has created a little bit of a violation around the Child Rights Act that we know. So this in itself affects the entire value chain of what the home front should be. And for me, again, it is because of the inability to develop coping mechanisms. If we have developed those coping frameworks, coping mechanisms, the adaptation strategies, perhaps there will have been some level of mitigation. Now you talked about the light. It is about priority. How does the family prioritize their needs? So I think, again, it's about how they communicate. But again, it is also goes to tell that the kinds of consequences of our inaction to the environment is actually creating a little bit of an additional threat that we are witnessing. So once this happens, it affects the entire value chain in the home front, in the community. And one of the things that you see in communities is that you begin to see some level of communal clashes that are also playing out. And this is actually huge in different locations, because the moment migration or as a shift in the existing land to a different land for purposes of trying to meet livelihood, you will be encroaching into somebody else's land. And this in itself has become one of the biggest consequences or indicators that has actually been pointed out in various happenings as to why communal clashes had always been on the increase.
Yeah. So how optimistic are you that solutions can be found for Nigerians' environmental issues and security issues? How optimistic are you?
Well, for me, first of all, is that we have a national adaptation plan, which I think should be able to help in terms of response, mitigation. We have also the National Climate Change Policy, which also offers you some pathway. We may not be there, but I think those kinds of strategic roadmaps offers us an opportunity to be able to begin to ask ourselves that, okay, it may not be perfect document, but it might offer us some little bit of a guide into what we want to see. So there is some level of hope, but again, the concern is considering the current economic downturn that we have and that we're experiencing, how does government intend to finance those kind of pathways? Because again, it might not be the priority of government at the moment, and the consequence would be that you have a plan, but you don't have the funding arrangement for it, and that therefore suggests that this cycle of violence or conflict might continue. The second thing is that there are also interested parties from different parts of the world who are also showing some level of interest in how to manage this sort of decline in the environment, and they are providing some support for it. But when you have a universal pathway that is not localized, I think again for me, that is where I have some concern, because if you have a national action plan, but the states have not localized it to contextualize how the climate change conversation affects them in a peculiar way, opportunities are there that we may not actually harvest the gain very quickly. And I think state governments should be able to also look at this as a priority for them to engage with.
Okay, so I was going to end it on that last question, but you brought in the government. So let's talk about the government. What's the government's response? Their response from what how you've been interacting with them. Does it in any way addresses environmental degradation and the rising insecurity?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are not seeing that happening. The regulators and the operators have collaborated to put the community in a more difficult situation. And that, for me, is where the challenges really lies. For instance, the UNEP report and the cleanup of the Niger Delta as a result of various environmental degradation has not really gained traction. So the question would be, government is saddled with the responsibility to oversight the process, but we are not seeing any deliberate efforts in that happening. So for me, again, it is about what is the political will from the side of the state to make this happen. The second thing is that even in the Niger Delta, there is something that is called having a remediation plan. The remediation plan therefore says you have emergency measures, 8 of the emergency measures, and these are on the states to provide. One of which is to do a water reticulation and provide water. 2 is to do health outreach. 3 is to provide some of those safeguards for livelihood. The question is, how are we doing that? What is the alternatives that we are putting on the table to allow livelihood to continue to sustain? So the question will be that government in itself has not developed its own roadmaps in terms of how they want to solve this issue in perpetual. But perhaps let us be optimistic and be hopeful that because these templates exist, maybe there will be some level of revitalization around them.
We are own drivers of our environment. How we want to see the environment behoves on each and every one of us to be protectors of the environment. We cannot leave the environment to die and expect it to live for us. On this note, we've come to the end of today's episode, and you'll agree with me that it's been an inciting and interesting conversation with Salaudeen Hashim, who is the program's director at Clean Foundation and also a security and a defense expert. Thank you for being part of today's episode, and we hope that when we call on you some other time to join us, you'll be part of it.
Thank you for having me.
Please join us in our next episode as we continue to discuss environmental issues. Remember to visit our website, www.homef.org, and follow our social media platforms on all handle at EchoHomef. I remain your host, Kome Odomo.